I was wondering if you would say a word about Marcion, and also if you would consider 1 Clement to be a first century witness to the text of 1 Corinthians.
Oh, wow. I feel like I'm in my doctoral exam all of a sudden. Wow. Okay. Okay, Marcion. The short on Marcion was probably the most important Christian thinker of the 2nd century. He was a kind of a teacher philosopher type from Asia Minor, who took the Apostle Paul very seriously when Paul differentiated between the gospel of Christ and the law of the Jews. Paul thought that a person could not be made right with God by keeping the requirements of the Jewish law, but a person had to have faith in Christ. And so this differentiation between law and gospel for Marcion became an absolute differentiation. That the God who gave the law could not be the God who gave the gospel. So that Marcion taught that there were actually two different gods. That the God of the Old Testament was in fact a different God from the God of Jesus. That the God of Jesus, in fact, tried to save people from the condemnation of the God of the Jews. The idea is the God of the Jews created this world, gave Israel the law, everybody breaks this law, and so this Jewish God condemns them. Justly. I mean, they broke the law, so they're condemned. Jesus comes from a higher God who never had anything to do with this world before Jesus showed up. Jesus came to save people from the wrathful God of the Jews. And so Marcion tried to propound this point of view and won a lot of converts. In fact, in his day, he was extremely successful. There were a lot of Marcionite churches that started up. And in some parts of the Christian world, it looks like this Marcionite understanding of Christianity was the dominant form of Christianity. In this form of Christianity, the Christian Bible didn't have an Old Testament, because that was the book of the Jews. And it had the Christian New Testament consisted of Paul's letters. Marcion knew of 10 of Paul's letters, and one gospel, the Gospel of Luke. So it was Luke and 10 letters. I mean, some of us are glad that Marcion didn't succeed, because those of us who teach New Testament would only have half-time jobs now. Anyway, so that was Marcion. The second question is, does 1 Clement give us any attestation for the text of 1 Corinthians? So 1 Clement is a book that is in a collection called the Apostolic Fathers. It was probably written in the mid-90s, and so it was actually written before some of the books of the New Testament. It was written to the church in Corinth by the Christians of Rome. And it was actually kind of an interesting situation that led to this letter. There apparently was some kind of ecclesiastical coup in Corinth, where the leaders of the church had been ousted somehow or other. We don't know how. And some other people had taken over, and the people in Rome didn't like it. And they tried to reverse this coup that had happened. And so this author then is writing to the church in Corinth to try and straighten things out. And this author knows about 1 Corinthians, and in fact reflects a lot of Paul's letter, 1 Corinthians, which was written about 30 years earlier. I don't think it gives us any help for knowing the text of 1 Corinthians, if by that you mean, does it help us reconstruct what the actual words of 1 Corinthians were? I don't think it helps us with that, but it does reflect many of the themes that you find in 1 Corinthians. Yes?
With the possible exception of Matthew 24, where Jesus says, not even the Son knows, none of the textual examples that you've given tonight pose any problem for fundamental Christian doctrines. And I'm wondering if there are textual examples that are more threatening on that front. My second question is, to what extent were canon and textual problems discussed at Nicaea?
Okay, the second question is quite easy. To what extent were the formation of the canon of the New Testament and the text of the New Testament discussed at Nicaea? The answer is not at all.
The Da Vinci Code says they were, so...
yes.
Who should I believe?
Yes. Right. I think you need to trust Dan Brown. He did a lot of research for this book. He learned, for example, that Leonardo's name was really Da Vinci. Yeah, according to the Da Vinci Code, of course, the Council of Nicaea was where there was a vote on whether Jesus was the Son of God or not, and it was actually a close vote. And that is completely bogus. Everything he says about the Council of Nicaea is absolutely wrong. The Council of Nicaea didn't talk about the formation of the canon, which books would go in, which books would go out. Constantine had no role to play in that decision at all, nothing to do with it, so far as we know. So that's just... that's something he came up with. That is no bearing on historical reality, I think. Are there textual changes that affect Christian doctrine? Well, it kind of depends how you look at things. There certainly are passages that affect Christian doctrine. There are passages in which scribes changed passages to emphasize that Jesus was divine. They changed other passages to emphasize that he was human. And so they wanted to emphasize that he was both human and divine. And so they changed passages so that it would look that way. One passage in particular is kind of interesting that is directly related to Christian doctrine, is the doctrine of the Trinity is not explicitly taught in any passage of the Bible. In other words, the doctrine that there are three gods... Sorry. Dan Brown speaking once more. The doctrine that there's one God manifest in three persons, that these three persons are each individually completely God, but there's only one God. Not three gods, but one God, but not one person, three persons. So the three in one. This is not taught in any passage of the Bible except 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, in which the author says that there are three witnesses in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. That's a pretty explicit statement about the Trinity. Now, there's an interesting story about this passage because it doesn't show up in the Greek manuscripts of 1 John. It's in the Latin manuscripts of 1 John. When the first scholar to put together a printed Greek New Testament produced his work, this was Erasmus, who was a humanist from Rotterdam, in the year 1516. He put together for the first time the printed edition of the Greek New Testament. He didn't include the verse, because it wasn't in the manuscripts that he had. And the Latin theologians went ballistic. And according to the story that circulated, Erasmus said, look, it's not in any of the Greek manuscripts. And they said, yes, but it's part of the church's doctrine. You've gotten rid of the Trinity. And Erasmus said, look, if you can produce a Greek manuscript that has it in it, I'll include it in my next edition. And so they produced a Greek manuscript. And so they copied out a Greek, somebody copied out a Greek, and when they got to that point, they translated the Latin back into Greek, stuck it in, and Erasmus was true to his word and included that in his next edition. And it was on the basis of that edition that the King James Bible translators put the Bible into English. So that's why the verse showed up in the King James translation. So yeah, that certainly affects doctrine. Now the thing is, you could argue the doctrine of the Trinity without that verse. You can argue theology without any particular verse, because theology is never just kind of rooted in a particular word or it's a bigger thing than all that. And so my view is that Christian doctrine isn't based on any of these textual variations. What happens, though, is these textual variations sometimes change the way what a verse means. Sometimes they affect what an entire chunk of a book means. Sometimes these textual changes affect the very meaning of an entire book. And that's theologically significant to me. Not that it necessarily changes anybody's precious doctrines or their chosen doctrines, but it does affect what the books of the Bible mean, and that's theologically significant, I think. Yes?
Yes, I appreciated your lecture. I haven't read Misquoting Jesus, but I enjoyed your Da Vinci Code book last year. It was got me thinking. Seriously, I did like it a lot. A question I have regarding the attempts to harmonize the crucifixion accounts, whether they can be harmonized or not, concerns the logical approach that's appropriate to use, and this is what I'd ask your comment on. Aristotelian logic basically indicates that omission is not necessarily contradiction. At the Stanford philosophy website, I think it's the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I forget exactly, there's a very elegant summary of Aristotle's definition of a contradiction. Basically, in my limited style, I'll just say it's a situation where you have two statements that cannot both be true at the same time regarding the same situation. The statement that Bart, Ehrman, and Bob Gregg are in this room does not contradict the statement that Bart is in this room. it does contradict the statement that only Bart is in this room. So when you add the word only, that's a concern. And so, given the fact that the gospel writers were not attempting to be exhaustive, as long as Mark doesn't say the only thing Jesus said was Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, I'm not sure that there's an issue there. It's like if there was a traffic accident. One witness might say, well, the red car swerved and hit the pedestrian. Another person might say, well, actually, before that, it was a blue car that cut the red car off that I saw that hit the pedestrian. But there's not, they have different details, but the test, the threshold for saying it's a contradiction seems to me to be higher than what you're setting it at.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. And I think, part of it, there are a couple things to say about it. One is, it depends what you're after. If you're after what each witness is saying, then it's not fair to make the one witness say what the other witness is saying, because they're saying different things. Absolutely. And so if what you're interested in is what the witness has to say, then you have to stick with what that witness has to say. Right.